Hello, my name is Joseph Rollinson and I'm an engineer here at Duolingo working on the Learning Assessment team. And I am really excited to spend a bit of time today talking about how we measure Duolingo's effectiveness. But before we do that, I want to step back and talk a little bit about Duolingo's mission. So at Duolingo, our goal is to develop the best education in the world and make it universally available. And as part of that, we need to be able to measure how effective we are at teaching so that we can find ways to improve. And for that purpose, we have a team called the Learning Assessment team, whose goal is to evaluate Duolingo's efficacy so that we can make a more effective product and show the world that Duolingo is an effective way to learn a language. And in this talk today, I'm going to spend some time on two different approaches to assessment that we focus on here at Duolingo: in-app assessment and external assessment. And for both of those, I'm going to talk about an example of how that approach has impacted us at Duolingo. All right, so let's talk a little bit about in-app assessment. So in-app assessment can be thought of as simply measuring the effectiveness of Duolingo using data collected inside the app. We have millions of learners using the product on every day, and we can collect a huge amount of really rich, detailed data from how they interact with the product. And we can use that data to learn what is making this product effective and what things can we do to make Duolingo even more effective. One example of in-app assessment is the checkpoint quiz. So if you're not familiar with how Duolingo works, as you progress through a course, the courses are broken into sections, and at the end of each section, there is a checkpoint quiz. And this checkpoint quiz is designed to measure how well you have learned the material in the previous section of the course. And this checkpoint quiz is an incredible opportunity for us because it gives us a place where we can measure how well our learners have achieved the goals that we set for them in terms of learning a language. Now, the items in the checkpoint quiz are all designed by curriculum experts, and that means that we spend a huge amount of effort building out this pool of items. This pool of items is also incredibly large. We are measuring all of the important concepts that we have taught in each section of these courses, and that requires thousands of items. Not only that, but these quiz items test vocabulary, grammar, reading, listening, and even writing. Now, the checkpoint quiz, as described here, isn't used in every single course at Duolingo, and that's primarily because of the amount of time and effort it takes for us to develop all of the items for the checkpoint quiz. But we are constantly growing the number of courses which have the checkpoint quiz and improving the items in the checkpoint quiz. My favorite thing about the checkpoint quiz is the pre-test, post-test design. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that here. So if you think about a Duolingo learner as they go through a course, first they complete section 1, then they take the checkpoint quiz 1, then they complete section 2, and they take checkpoint quiz 2, and so on and so forth. And we can see that kind of visualized here. And you may be wondering, well, what kinds of items are showing up in quiz 1? Well, probably unsurprising. We have a bunch of items that test the section that they had just completed, so section 1 here. And this allows us to measure, well, how well did the learners achieve, or how well do they know, at least, the content that we've taught in that section of the course. But we also have a bunch of items that are designed to measure the next section of the course. And this is what we call a pretest. And you may be thinking, well, this seems like a waste of time. Obviously, everyone's going to do really poorly on these items. Well, not necessarily, because unlike a school maybe, Duolingo learners are coming from an incredible variety of backgrounds and with a very varying levels of knowledge of the language. And we want to make sure that we are taking that into account when we're measuring our effectiveness. So it's really important that we try to control for how much learners knew before they started a particular section of the course. This also explains why the checkpoint quiz can be really hard, because we're asking you to perform challenges that you haven't seen before, and there aren't hints, and we know that that's a really difficult experience. But to make that a little bit less concerning, we make it so that the checkpoint quiz is completely unfailable. And that is so that learners can progress even if they don't do perfectly on the checkpoint quiz. We then show exactly the same items in the post-test. So this allows for a given user for us to see the gain, so how much scores changed from before they started doing the content to after they completed it. And this structure is then repeated. So there's a section 3 pre-test, a section 3 post-test, and so on and so forth. So you may be asking, well, that's all well and good, but what can you actually do with the checkpoint quiz? Well, there are a bunch of things that we use the checkpoint quiz for. I'm going to talk about 2 of them here. One way that we use the checkpoint quiz is to investigate how well we are teaching the grammatical concepts that we are teaching inside each section of the course. And for that reason, we developed a dashboard that updates every single day that is accessible to anybody at Duolingo with all of the information about the grammatical concepts that we teach inside the app. And this data comes directly from the checkpoint quiz. The checkpoint quiz items are all tagged with the grammatical concepts that they test, and that allows us to measure very precisely how well we teach all of these grammatical concepts. Another thing that we do is we correlate user behaviors with checkpoint quiz scores. And all that really means is that we look at what behaviors that a user have done between the pre-test and the post-test, how well those different behaviors correlate with how well they do on the post-test. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this relatively complicated diagram, but the basic idea here is that this kind of information allows us to say things like, how well do level 1 lessons teach the concepts that we're trying to teach? Or how much of an effect does completing stories have on checkpoint quiz scores? And so it's a really powerful approach because it means that we can use the checkpoint quiz not only to make our content better, but also to inform product decisions inside the app. So that's kind of how we use the checkpoint quiz, which is one of the primary types of in-app assessment that we do. In-app assessment in general has been a really powerful tool with us, but there are a couple things that we can't do directly, or it's at least harder to do with in-app assessment. One of those is comparisons to other methods of learning a language. If we want to become the best way to learn a language in the world, we need to understand how Duolingo compares to other methods of learning a language. And in-app assessment doesn't quite get us there. And for that reason, we rely on external assessment. External assessment is using data collected outside of the app to measure the effectiveness of Duolingo. One type of external assessment that we have found really successful is user studies. And all that means is that we recruit Duolingo learners to complete some task. Now, this task could be completing a survey, it could be taking a proficiency test, it could be generally anything that we think could be a really useful signal for us measuring the effectiveness of Duolingo. So if you ever see an email like this one, you should participate. We really, really value the data that we collect in these studies. So now we've talked about these 2 different approaches to assessment. In-app assessment, which is fast and free for us to do because we can just use the data that we're already collecting. And we tend to use in-app assessment for rapid product improvement. So finding ways that we can make the product and our content better. External assessment is slower. It's quite expensive because we tend to pay our participants, but it allows us to compare Duolingo to other approaches of learning a language. So now that we've spent some time talking about in-app assessment and external assessment, we're going to talk about something that I'm very excited about, which is the Duolingo Efficacy Study. Now, our motivation with this study is that we wanted to know how much our learners were learning from the first 5 sections of the Spanish and French courses for English speakers. And the reason we were so interested in this is that we had just spent a lot of time improving these courses and changing the content, and we wanted to see whether that work had paid off. Our methodology here was that we were going to recruit Duolingo learners to complete a background survey and then take a couple proficiency tests, reading and listening proficiency tests, to be clear. Now, the background survey, if you're interested, you can see a couple of the types of items that we ask, and this background survey is basically there so we have a better understanding of who our participants are and what their background is before using Duolingo. We then were going to compare the scores that we collected from these 2 assessments with 2 university student data sets. And these university data sets consisted of university students who had completed different numbers of semesters of foreign language instruction in Spanish and French. So this data set gives us an opportunity to compare how well Duolingo learners perform on reading and listening proficiency tests to university students who have completed different numbers of semesters of foreign language instruction. The participants for this study were Duolingo learners in the Spanish and French courses who had just completed Checkpoint 5. They also only had a low prior proficiency in the language, and what we mean by that is that when we asked these participants how much knowledge they had in the language before using Duolingo, they all stated that they had a low level of prior knowledge. We also did not consider participants who were taking classes or using other programs. And the main reason we did this is we wanted to ensure that the learning outcomes that we were measuring came from using Duolingo, not other methods of learning a language. Finally, we only considered participants who were based in the United States. And the main reason we were unable to incorporate learners from other countries is that the data sets that we were comparing against were also only for university students in the United States. And we wanted to make sure that the populations were as comparable as possible. The tests that we ended up using were actual reading and listening proficiency tests. These are online and proctored tests, which means that there was actually somebody watching each person complete the test. And the reason we make sure that our tests are proctored is to ensure that there is no cheating or other funny business happening while they take these tests. This is also the same tests that were used by both of the university data sets that we were going to compare to. If you want to have an idea of what these items may look like, here's an item from the listening test on the right. All right, so we've spent a little bit of time talking about how the study was run. Now we get to talk about the fun part, the results. Well, we were so excited by the results that we found. The first thing we found was that Duolingo learners performed as well in these reading and listening proficiency tests as university students who had completed 4 semesters of foreign language instruction. And this was a huge, huge milestone for us because it meant that these learners were learning reading and listening proficiency at the same, to the same level as university students who had completed 4 semesters of university instruction. And of course, the next question that we asked ourselves is, well, how does the amount of time spent compare to time spent in a university course? And our baseline here was that we know that it takes roughly 240 hours for a university student to complete 4 semesters of language instruction. And so to build a comparison point, we decided to collect all of the sessions that our participants had completed since creating their account on Duolingo in these different courses and sum up all of the time spent in lessons, skill practice, global practice, stories, everything. And we just added up all of that time to see how that compared to this 240-hour number. And what we found was that Duolingo learners spent roughly 110 hours using Duolingo to learn the language. So this was incredible. It meant that our learners, our participants in this study, got to the same reading and listening proficiency levels as university students in half the time. Now, it is important to note that this is only reading and listening. Our study only measured reading and listening proficiency. It didn't measure writing proficiency. It didn't measure speaking proficiency. And there are a ton of other things that make up learning a language. But still, we are so excited by these findings. So that's most of what I had to talk about today. If you're interested in Duolingo's efficacy, please check out our website, duolingo.com/efficacy. This is where we share all of our most up-to-date findings and blog posts and papers and reports and journal articles and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in staying up to date on our efficacy work, please check us out. And with that, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Joseph, it's amazing to think how much Duolingo has changed over the years since Luis started it with a Spanish course he wrote himself. People are often very critical though, and one of their criticisms seems to be, well, how can this be a serious language learning tool when it's got all these cute cartoons on it and it's fun? How do you balance making learning fun and actually presenting this serious language learning app?
It's a really great question. I think it's, the key to Duolingo's success has been making a product that people find engaging and fun so that they stick with learning a language. One of the things that we've seen is that if you aren't interested in learning a language, or you're getting bored with learning a language, you're just not going to use the product and you're not going to learn anything. So we do feel that people being engaged and excited and having fun learning a language is actually key to the effectiveness of the product too. And so what we always try to do is find ways of making the app more effective whilst still maintaining a really fun and engaging product. There have been a couple examples of ways that we've changed the product to keep its engaging, fun atmosphere whilst still being a really powerful way of learning a language. One is a few years ago, we introduced a concept called crowns or levels. And the idea here was skills before crowns and levels were just sort of a set of lessons that users or learners could go through. And once they'd gone through those lessons, they could practice the skill again. But that was basically it. And one of the things that we changed was we made it so that each skill had a level. And so skills got, as you did more and more content in a skill, it got harder and harder. And one of the really powerful things about this approach was that it meant that people who were really excited about diving deep into a language and really enjoying that harder content could get that harder experience. And people who were sort of more casual learners were more interested in, spending their time on something, fun, but also entertaining, could sort of learn at a sort of different pace. And so another thing that we have found is really powerful for both improving the engagement of the product and making it better at teaching is really focusing on high quality content. So one of the things that we have invested a huge amount of effort in over the past few years is really improving and updating and constantly finding ways of making the content on Duolingo better at teaching. And what we have actually found is that if we do that, people continue to use the app at an even higher rate because people can really feel that the product is getting them to a better learning level. So one thing that we found is that these two things are actually very, very connected. Being effective at teaching and being engaging are actually much more closely entwined than you may think.
When people, just members of the public and users, when they're on Twitter saying, I want Duolingo to do this, or I don't like when Duolingo does this, do you get ideas of how to change Duolingo from what they are saying, or is it sometimes a bit too personal to what that specific person wants?
I think it can really depend on the feedback. I mean, we found that listening to our users is absolutely integral to building a good experience, and that is why we have built features inside the app to let people give feedback. So, for example, on every single sentence in a challenge on Duolingo, users have the opportunity to report any issues with those sentences, report things that might not sound quite right, or if they feel like they got it right but weren't graded correctly. And that is tremendously valuable information. And we use that in a ton of different ways to improve the quality of our courses. So in that level, we use that kind of content. We get lots of great ideas from our feedback. At the same time, we are a very metrics-driven organization, and so we do really try to test all of those changes that we do make. So even if we get an idea from Twitter or Reddit or wherever, we do always make sure to test it and make sure that it has the kinds of effects that we want. Because it's intuitions can be very deceiving sometimes.
And with the efficacy studies, are you running, or are you thinking of running any of those in the courses that are designed for non-English speakers?
Oh, definitely. I mean, one of the most one area that we really want to focus on measuring the effectiveness of is our English courses. So courses for people learning English. We think that these courses can really transform lives, and that really starts with an effective curriculum. So so we're very interested in getting a better understanding of, for example, how well our English course for Spanish speakers is teaching, as well as our English from Portuguese, as well as all of them. And another thing just to keep in mind is we have a bunch of other tools which we use to measure the effectiveness of these courses as well. So, for example, the checkpoint quiz is available in both our English for Spanish and English from Portuguese courses, and we use the data from that constantly to try to improve those English courses.
What other kinds of ways that you measure effectiveness of the courses?
We have a lot of different tools for measuring effectiveness. One that I'm really, really excited about is something that we call review challenges. And the idea here is that we take items from a skill that's coming up. We take items from skills that users have already completed, and we put them in lessons later in the user experience, and we see how much do people remember of the content that they have been shown previously. So it's sort of like a review, like how well have you remembered the content that you've been introduced to. And it's really early days, but the results that we have found have been just absolutely incredible, because we can collect a huge amount of data from this technique and use it in a variety of different ways, where we can't, for example, we can't run an efficacy study on all of our users because that would be prohibitively expensive, but we can use these review challenges for literally every single user that uses Duolingo. And so that's been a really powerful tool.
And also for them, they're like, yes, I got that one right, even though...
Yes, exactly.
Of course they do.
We really, and that is also part of it. One thing that we've noticed is that people do like these review challenges, and we think it's an engaging way of introducing, content from previous sessions back into the experience.
What role do volunteers play in Duolingo as learners in test studies or as contributors to the courses?
Volunteers are in many ways, the lifeblood of Duolingo. We couldn't do so many of the things we want to do without volunteers, from building some of our best courses, to moderating our forum, to testing new features that haven't been introduced to the public yet. You know, volunteers really do play a just tremendous role in allowing us to fulfill our mission. Yeah, huge players in the Duolingo ecosystem.
If people want to get involved, what do they need to do?
Oh, well, it depends what you would like to do. If you are interested in building Duolingo courses, we have something called Incubator, which is our tool for building courses. And you can, if you go to the Duolingo Incubator, you can sign up to participate in building one of our courses. I will note that we're relatively selective in terms of the people who build out these courses, but it's an absolutely fantastic way to have an impact on millions of people learning a language that you care about.
How's your job changed over the time that you've been doing it?
Oh, my job has changed so much. When I started at Duolingo about 5 years ago. There were around roughly 50 people working at Duolingo at the time. So we have grown tremendously since then, and it's just been such a pleasure to see the organization and the product grow and mature over the past 5 years. At the moment, you know, my role has transitioned a lot from building features to trying to measure learning to building, you know, content. It's just been an absolute pleasure to see all of the ways that we can, you know, make Duolingo a more effective product.
Well, thanks for that. It's very much appreciated. Thank you so much also for telling us about what goes into making Duolingo, Joseph.
No, thank you.